Test Drive 6 is one of the first video games I remember playing, and I have a long-standing fondness for it. Unfortunately for me, Test Drive 6 is also terrible in almost every single way. Explaining why I love this dumpster fire of a game is not going to be easy, but after nearly 20 years of playing it religiously, I think I'm finally ready to take a crack at defending it. So, what's so bad about Test Drive 6? How did the brand go from blazing trails to bombing reviews? And after all this time, why the hell do I still put up with it? Our story begins in 1982, with Don Matrick, yes, that one, and his friend Jeff Sember. The then teenagers started Distinctive Software Incorporated in Sember's living room, where they wrote some of the first commercially successful Canadian video games. In 1987, Distinctive released Test Drive, a revolutionary driving game that featured detailed graphics and officially licensed supercars from the likes of Ferrari and Porsche. The game was a hit, selling over 250,000 copies across DOS and other home computer versions, such as the Amiga, Atari ST, and the Apple II. The game was published by Accolade, with distribution in the UK being handled by Electronic Arts. 2 years later, Test Drive got a sequel. Test Drive 2 largely resembled its predecessor, but this time, the player could race against a computer-controlled opponent, earning the game a subtitle of The Duel. The game came to even more computer platforms, and even to the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, which both delivered passable versions of the experience. While not an entirely new concept, the addition of computer opponents was a big step for driving games to this scale and graphical complexity, as Test Drive 2 delivered an experience more reminiscent of arcades than something you find on a tape or cartridge, something noticed by Sega, who commissioned Distinctive to port Outrun to DOS machines. To make a long story short, Distinctive used parts of their code from Test Drive 2 to make Outrun for DOS, resulting in a lawsuit from Accolade who claimed that the tech behind the game was their intellectual property. Distinctive won the suit, and promptly lost the Test Drive license, presumably due to sour relations with Accolade. Distinctive was acquired by Electronic Arts soon thereafter, and reformed into EA Canada, where the minds behind Test Drive created a small, obscure racing game series that you might have heard of. As for Test Drive, Accolade moved development to their own internal studio for Test Drive 3, The Passion, before putting the series on ice. Things were quiet for a while. Then, in 1997, Accolade pulled the Test Drive name from the back of the freezer, and proceeded to absolutely shovel out new racers. Not to be outdone by Need for Speed, the Test Drive brand was to have 2 new entries every year, one mainline entry and an entry in a new spin-off series about off-roading. The new beginning for Test Drive was in the hands of Bull Syndicate, a brand new studio formed specifically to work on the franchise. Bull would create mainline Test Drive titles starting with Test Drive 4 in 1997, and took detours to make Demolition Racer, as well as the second Test Drive off-road game. The studio was growing with each release, but the same could not be said for the Reputation. Test Drive 4 was met with mixed reception, with some critics going as far as to describe the game as feeling like driving your car while on medication. The off-road spin-off series had similar issues, but to be fair, off-roading has a fair amount of complexity to it, and the reviews acknowledged that few games had done it well by 1999, speculating that it just was not in the cards for the 5th generation of console hardware. The asphalt racing of the mainline series was a different story. By the time Test Drive resurfaced in 1997, EA's Need for Speed series had a 2-game head start, appearing first on the 3DO, but later on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, as well as on PC. I won't pretend that the first 2 Need for Speed games have aged like fine wine, but in my opinion, the original Need for Speed from 1994 looks and controls better than Test Drive 4, and critics were quick to point out that Pitbull could not hold a candle to EA's offerings. These 2 franchises filled a pretty unique niche in the 1990s. They were more realistic than arcade offerings like Rush or Outrun, less realistic than Sims and Sim Lights like EA's Sports Car GT or Gran Turismo, and they offered licensed cars. That last part is important, because this was the 1990s, a mystical time before YouTube, Twitch, and day-and-date game reviews. Unless your favorite magazine happened to cover a game before release, the box art was really the only indicator of what a game was like. Need for Speed always did this well. These covers look awesome, and even communicate some key features of the games. Looking at Test Drive's covers, I can glean exactly one piece of information. These dudes really like the Dodge Viper. In fairness, the Viper is one of the most iconic cars of the 1990s, and I'm sure the front and center depiction helped the sales of all 3 games. But there's more than a little bit of foreshadowing in the similar cover art. At first, Test Drive 6 seems to offer a spectacular amount of content variety. For starters, the tracks. There are 17 of them, and surprisingly, they're mostly unique and memorable. Some of the circuits are a little run-of-the-mill, but it's more than made up for by the long, sprawling point-to-point tracks, and tracks like Cape Hatteras, with forks and jumps to keep you interested. These are all based on real-world locations with the exception of the fictional Pelton Raceway. In each location, the traffic drives on the correct side of the road, except for in Maui for some reason, and police cars are modeled after real-world cops in that part of the world. Even with long, 16-race tournaments in the final leg of the game's progression, the races never felt repetitive. It's something I always took for granted, but given what I reviewed recently, I was genuinely impressed. Until I booted up Test Drive 5 and found myself driving on tracks that were distractingly familiar. A large number of the game's 17 tracks are directly pulled from the last game. You see, Test Drive 6 reuses a lot of assets from the 5th game, which itself reuses assets from the 4th. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. It does provide customers with more content in one package, and it lets the player drive new vehicles on old tracks and vice versa. Besides, Need for Speed High Stakes also offers tracks from previous entries. This is more of an observation than a complaint, as I played Test Drive 6 for 20 years before realizing the tracks were recycled. The earlier tracks are definitely less complex than the new ones, but again, this is not a complaint, just an observation. In terms of other recycled content, Test Drive 6 uses sound effects, car models, and other assets found in previous entries. Like I said, this is not a problem in itself, but certain assets look like trash in 1997 and look like super trash in 1999. Compare the convertible dude in Test Drive 6 with the convertible dude from Need for Speed High Stakes, and there's no contest. Stuff like this 100% could and should have been changed. If Test Drive 6 was the first game he appeared in, it would be different, but this was his 3rd consecutive year as Test Drive's only humanoid character. I don't care how tight of a timeline or budget Infogram gave Pitbull. A modeler could have banged out something better than this in an afternoon. Also, the siren sound effect is obnoxious and grating. It's a 1-second loop with no variations or alternate tones, and it's insanely loud. Best I can tell, it doesn't scale with volume settings, or if it does, the change is so minute I've not noticed. On the PC, I usually play with the sound completely off, because there are environmental sounds that once again do not scale with game volume, and I believe they play unintentionally fast and often on modern PCs. I hear this shit in my brain when I'm dissociating on public transit. I've never been one to let relatively minor issues like these get in the way of enjoying a game, but Test Drive 6's problems go far, far deeper than asset reuse or the occasional bad sound effect. Let's start with the most immediately apparent issue. This game's graphics. If I had to pick one word to describe how Test Drive 6 looks, I'd be a bit pressed to choose between unfortunate and hilarious. In a world where Gran Turismo and Ridge Racer Type 4 had been on the market for years, there was absolutely no reason for a game to look like, well, this. Some of the car models look alright, but the vast majority are just... what? Okay, perfect example. Nissan Skyline R34. One of the most iconic cars of the 1990s. Take a nice, long look at that ass. What do you think it looks like in Test Drive 6? Graphics don't make the game, but there is no legitimate reason for Test Drive 6 to look like this. I could tolerate the looks if the game ran well, but it suffers from constant slowdown and frame rate fluctuations that are not only annoying and ugly, but actually make the game harder to play. Too often the game would slow down mid-turn, so I'd hold the steering longer so I could complete the maneuver, only for the frame rate to rocket back up to full speed, causing me to spin or overshoot the turn. It's not like the Dreamcast couldn't handle the game. Tokyo Extreme Racer was a launch title, ran at 60 FPS, and looked great doing it. Why does this far less impressive game have so much trouble? There's a fair amount of pop-in. Okay, sometimes a lot of pop-in. On the other hand, the PlayStation port actually looks fairly decent by PS1 standards. Some of the more questionable textures and models are hidden by that signature PS1 look. It feels a bit weird to say a game looks better on PS1 than on Dreamcast, but it speaks a lot more to the priorities of the dev team than the capabilities of either console. It's pretty clear that the PlayStation was the lead platform for Test Drive 6. This version of the game features actual night racing with projected headlights, something other versions replace with a slight reduction of gamma and the sunset JPEG in the sky. The PS1 version has more control options, including an option for analog gas and brake on DualShock controllers, and it even fixes some of the game's issues. Wait, the Skyline has proper taillights? Why did the PS1 version have a better model than the others? Never mind the fact that the PS1 is the weakest platform of the three by far. It came out 2 weeks before the PC version and a full month before the Dreamcast version. How does this even happen? With all of that in mind, it might seem like the PlayStation version is the one to play, but there is a catch. Remember how I said the Dreamcast had slowdown problems? Well... God, this game runs like absolute dog shit. The problem with the fluctuations isn't as bad on the Dreamcast, but that's because rather than eventually recovering to a playable frame rate, the PS1 just stays at low speed most of the time. My world record PS1 speedrun of this game has an in-game time of 1 hour and 22 minutes. The real time, 2 hours 30. This means that I spent the entire playthrough barely above 50% speed, and it will definitely feel that slow at times. This issue is not exclusive to the PlayStation, but it's definitely the worst offender, which is a shame, because despite its lower fidelity, this is the best looking version of the game. Also, the Dreamcast version only has one engine sound for some reason. There were a variety of engine tones in the PC, but all the cars sound exactly the same on the Dreamcast, which is puzzling. This game fits on a regular CDR. Why does the only version burned to a gigabyte disc have less audio? As far as controls on PC, you do have more options. You can, of course, use the arrow keys, and the controls are a little more manageable if you do. If you prefer a pad, no problem. It seems to natively recognize most modern gamepads. The game doesn't seem to recognize the triggers on my Xbox One controller though, so I do have to use the face button to accelerate. But other than that, it works perfectly. And I don't know if the physics are different, or if it's just the solid frame rate tricking my mind, but the PC version feels much easier to control than the others. It's still janky, but I found myself spinning out far less often, and being able to see where I'm going definitely helps too. There are 3 elements central to the design of every racing game: track design, physics and handling models, and controls. There are multiple valid ways to do all 3 of these things, but the key is making sure they all gel and provide a cohesive experience. Test Drive 6 doesn't. Almost every car in the game handles like a chihuahua on ice skates, or for a less hyperbolic analogy, as if the tires on each car are bald and dry-rotted. Attempting to turn with any sort of urgency will result in a spin. An acceptable choice for a sim, but not for an arcade racer. The tracks have obstacles such as trees or light poles that don't actually exist, about half of the time. The trick is remembering which trees and light poles have collision, which is pretty difficult with 17 tracks, 34 if you count the backward variants. Making matters worse, the hitboxes for these obstacles are easily 5 times as wide as they should be. Even if you do manage to avoid them, you're liable to hit an invisible one anyways. Or just one of the game's many invisible walls. You know why I thought, what the hell, that barrier was further left earlier when I crashed into it? It's because it fucking is. Now, I want you guys to tell me with complete honesty. You're going along here at like 100 miles per hour, and you see this. Do you think, does anything in your brain tell you you can't go forward there? The feeling of fun you get every time you get up to a high speed evaporates not if, but when you hit something you had no chance of avoiding. Arrows pointed at turns indicate the wrong direction, and all too often opponents would parallel park themselves in front of me, allowing the rest of the pack to pass. Even if you don't do anything wrong, the game will find ways to fuck you. Yeah, like random pedestrian vehicles. What? Oh, I'm mad! The reason I say this game is awful is because these physics, graphics, and controls make it a pretty intolerable experience, even by 1999 standards. Critics agreed, and yet 20 years later, I'm still playing it and hold it dear to my heart. Despite everything wrong with Test Drive 6, I just can't help but love it. Maybe it's that 90s techno soundtrack, or that banging car list, or the terrible physics resulting in hilarious pile-ups. But more than all of that, this game has a unique charm to it. Nostalgia? Maybe. But I feel similarly for a lot of 90s games, tech, and music I was never exposed to as a kid. Part of it comes down to that content variety I mentioned earlier. There are so many cars to choose from and so many distinct tracks to drive them on, and let's talk about this loading screen art. It's such a minor thing, but dude, these have stuck in my head since I was a kid. Since I've mostly finished tearing the game a new one, I should go into the elements of the gameplay that I like. Don't think I'm done comparing it to Need for Speed though. It would be pretty much impossible to ignore how similar Test Drive 6 is to its competition. Need for Speed High Stakes came out in March of 1999, 8 months before Test Drive 6, and I can't help but feel that certain new additions were lifted from the better remembered game. Test Drive 5's single-player offering was divided into tournaments segregated by car classes, and that hasn't changed. What has changed is the addition of betting. The player starts out with $40,000 in the bank and can pick a Class 1 car before heading into one of 2 tournaments. Before starting your first race, you'll have to put down some cash. Just a couple hundred at first, but eventually you'll be dropping a minimum of 15 stacks per race, with the AI matching however much you bet. Winning the overall tournament isn't too difficult, because the standings are determined by total race time, not a point system. But you will want to come first a lot and bet as much as you can, because not only will you win more after each race, the grand prize pool will be higher too. Cars in this game can get expensive, peaking at a cool $1 million for the Toyota GT1. Factor in upgrades and the ever-increasing minimum bet, and you'll find yourself strapped for cash from time to time. Does this all sound familiar to anyone else? Test Drive 6's new features are almost exactly the same as what EA added to High Stakes months earlier. Some part of me feel like this was definitely intentional, but once again, I'm not complaining. This was the first signs of the racing genre starting to flesh out the single-player experience. Even still though, Test Drive 6's tournament mode can easily be cleared in 2 to 3 hours. You can turn your attention to the other content, but there's really not much to speak of. There are a grand total of 6 challenges, which are pitifully easy time trials, and they only take you through a few of the game's courses. Cop Chase mode is kinda fun, but once again, only a few tracks make an appearance. Stopping all the racers unlocks Stop the Bomber, which puts you against one racer desperately eating bombs out of his window. This is fun enough, until you realize that the bomber almost always hits himself with the bomb and flips over, giving you an effortless win. There really should have been more side content, and I'm not really sure why it's so limited. There are 17 courses here, why not make use of all of them? On console, you can't even race most of the tracks in a single race, you have to back out to do a practice race, where you can't use your upgraded car. Instead, I find the best way to get more fun out of Test Drive 6 is to speedrun it. TD6 runners use a pretty unique strategy that mostly involves being thrifty with your cash. Max bet and payout amounts differ between platforms, but the gist of it is that you spend as little as possible, beat Class 1, skip Class 2 entirely by selling your starter car, buy the Cobra, beat Class 3, and then move on to Class 4, only doing one tournament per class. On PC, the route is pretty solid. The payouts are lower, so you basically have to buy the F-150 and win every race. On console, you can safely buy a faster car, and the community is still experimenting with different cars to see how much extra spending we can get away with. Sure, Test Drive 6's innumerable issues kill runs from time to time, but if you have a good sense of humor, it's more funny than infuriating. Running TD6 is really not much different from playing it normally, and with that in mind, this is a great game for a first-time speedrunner. The early 2000s brought the launch of the PS2 and the Xbox, and in 2002, Bull Syndicate was back with a new game and a new logo. I always thought Pitbull's original logo looked super sick, and I wasn't really sure why they changed it. But you know who else thought Pitbull's logo was super sick? Neo-Nazis, who plagiarized their exact logo and turned it into a hate symbol. I can't say I blame them for changing it, especially given that the offending groups were also based in the UK. And after an acquisition by Midway, Bull Syndicate would rebrand to Midway Studios Newcastle. After developing the final entry in the Rush franchise and Vin Diesel's hilarious Wheelman, Midway pulled the plug. Studio heads then founded Pitbull Studio in 2009, and they did nothing much of note until being merged into Epic Games to assist with the development of Unreal Engine 4. So, in a way, Pitbull went from playing second fiddle to Need for Speed, to helping define how hundreds of AAA and indie games alike would be made for years to come. An uplifting, if unexpected, ending to a story that started so rough. Test Drive 6 is special to me, but there are good reasons why most have forgotten it. If you've never played a Test Drive game, think about giving it a go. This game is basically free, and there's a lot of fun to be had. Whether you compete, or rather play casually, Test Drive 6 has enough personality and soul behind the jank to earn my recommendation. It's not a good game, but it is a good time. I'd like to take a minute to thank my generous patrons for making this video possible: Adam Wozniewski, Andre, Andrew Elmore, Ben M, Jesse Scales, Kai M, Caitlin Bowers, Mini-Me, Mr. W, Rachel, Ravage Jaguar, Thibaut Renault, and Thunder THR.